Welcome to this module on creating, configuring, and managing user identities and group identities, part of the identity governance in the Microsoft AZ-104 course. I'm Bob Tickleman, and I'm a Microsoft technical trainer, and I'm excited to be your guide for this training. We're going to take a look at specifically a deeper dive into users and devices, the groups, on how to manage them. We covered it lightly in another module when we talked about Microsoft Entra ID overall and the roles that these types of identities played. I'm going to cover a bit of it as we get into it, but we're going to focus in on the use of users and groups and the different types that you have available to you. When we take a look at user accounts, they've been traditionally managed in that on-premises world using Active Directory domain services. And people thought that they were the realm of the authority of that username. Now, that caused a significant issue with the proliferation of user accounts. We talked about in another recording this move forward to a thing that is generally referred to as Identity 2.0 and the new way to manage identities. No longer do we want people to have multiple identities managing multiple passwords. It became very difficult for them to manage, and what they would do to manage them is often write that information down, which made them susceptible to some kind of social engineering or compromise. When we start to reduce the number of user accounts that people have, the management of their passwords becomes a little bit easier. And one of the recommendations that we'll have is length over strength. We don't like short, complex passwords. And while you could have that capability enabled for an account, required complex passwords at minimum lengths, that became very difficult. And so the recommendation often goes length over strength. There's some stats that change based around technology, but there is a number that we often use that an 8-character password of complex length and strength, if it's 8 characters, can be cracked in about 3 days. The technology is pretty straightforward for what's called a brute force attack. If you take that password of being 8 characters with complex characteristics, move it to 22 characters and make it just alphanumeric characters, it becomes over 300 years using the same technology. So length over strength. And what we often recommend is a passphrase that goes along with that password that you're working with. So instead of trying to figure out characters of upper, lowercase, and weird characters, if I were to give an example, I'm a Star Trek fan, I might take something like live long and prosper, one of the famous lines from Star Trek. And so live long and prosper is, in all lowercase, getting very close to that 22 characters. So a great character passphrase that you might want to use, but it might not meet the complexity requirements. So you might need uppercase, lowercase, you might need numbers that are required by the password requirements. So I might say live long and prosper, NCC in capital letters 1701, which is the call signs of the Starship Enterprise. So now I'm meeting some of my complexity, but what happens if they needed, say, a character that is not just alphanumeric? So I might go live long and prosper in all lowercase, NCC 1701 with NCC being capitals, and the last one being the exclamation mark. So there's just one example of being able to create a length over strength type of password meeting your password requirements. Not part of the course. We do have the capabilities to put those password requirements in. We'll show that to you when we create our user accounts, but something you may want to take away and bring to your users. User accounts need to stop being used in the location where they're going to be used and created. For many decades, I've been going to customers, helping them with their systems, but I was usually in there for a very short period of time. I would show up at that customer, they would ask me for my credentials, and they would have pre-provisioned a username and password for me. And in many cases, they might even have a thing called an RSA token. You've probably seen them, those little devices that have those randomly generated product or numbers that they could use as an additional multi-factor authentication against the user account. So I get an envelope with the username and password with my RSA token. I would do my work and I would give it back to them at the end of the week. And they go, oh no, just keep it, you may be coming back. And I'm going, I ain't coming back. And I can show you, I've got a drawer full of those RSA tokens. Now they're expensive. They're several, about $10, $15. But more importantly, the algorithm to generate those numbers, if it gets compromised, all RSA tokens are compromised. So having them out in the wild where they're not being controlled is a huge potential security risk. So what we want to find a way is getting around that. And so I showed in another module, I'll show it here, that we have different ways to invite users in. In a previous module, we talked about this thing called an Azure tenant that has an Entra ID directory for that tenant. In that Entra ID, they have a one-to-one relationship, one directory per tenant. One tenant has one directory. Now, I'm going to be showing you an example on the whiteboard. I'll be doing an example of this inside of the demonstration. And there's a lab for this that you actually have to do this, where you're going to have multiple tenants that you create, and the identities live in those separate tenants. And you invite them in as guests inside of your tenant instead of having to create an identity specifically for them. But what you're seeing on the screen here is an example of the graphical interface. I'm going to be using the Azure portal. This is where this graphic comes from. There's also an Entra ID admin panel that you could give to, say, maybe a user account administrator without giving them access to the entire Azure portal and all the resource management that comes along with it. So it significantly reduces the administration plane and the knowledge that they need to manage it. But what you're seeing here, and we'll get in and we'll take a look at the creating a new user, that's going to come up in several different manners of creating a new user inside of your directory, or you're going to invite a user in from several different locations. Now, this has changed a little bit recently, and it will constantly evolve, as most things do in the cloud. When we invite a user in, they can come from what we often refer to as a B2C or a B2B, business to consumer, or a business to business identity. The business to consumer identities are being provided by third parties. They are things in the Microsoft world that fall into the 4 domains of @outlook.com, @live.com, @hotmail.com, @msn.com. So those 4, anybody could go to and register an email account against those. You could use those to be a business to consumer model. Maybe you have a Facebook account. Maybe you have a Google account. So you could use these third-party providers. Now, some of you might have even seen this. If you have a phone, I don't play the game, but you could be crushing candies possibly, and you've got an app that crushes candies on your phone. And they often ask you to authenticate that application that is owned by a company that has how many candies you've crushed. They keep all the scores. They keep that information in their environment, but they have you authenticate with your Facebook account in many cases. And so what you're going to do is give them your Facebook account that then authenticates against not an account in their system, but an account that is going to go to Facebook, be authenticated, and then unlock how many candies you've crushed so it can load up in the game. Now, one of the reasons they do that is because they then want to be able to allow you in their app to publish your success back into Facebook so that, again, it partly advertises their game on that platform using the identity that has access to your account. So that business to consumer, depending if you want those people to come in, you can work with those across a wide variety of providers that can provide that capability for you. In the business to business model, this is going to typically come from other tenants inside of Azure. Going back to my example at the very start, where I, as a Microsoft employee, have an account that Microsoft has created for me. I use that to authenticate and gain access to all my Microsoft resources. As I go to a customer now, they don't have to create an account for me. They are going to invite in my Microsoft account into their tenant. They're still going to be able to manage what I can gain access to, separating the authentication and authorization. 2 terms that sound the same but are different. The authentication is going to happen by Microsoft. The authorization is still under their control, controlling which resources in their environment that I can gain access to. And we'll cover that in other modules, as well as later on when we get into group memberships into this one. So now what happens is they no longer have to be worried about, is Bob still a Microsoft employee? Because imagine in the old world where they created an account for me, if I showed up and I wasn't working at Microsoft anymore, I showed up with my shirt and I had my hair all combed nicely and I looked presentable, said, hey, I'm Bob from Microsoft, I still might be able to use that account if they haven't got any management around it. But as soon as I leave Microsoft, I'm sure that they're going to get rid of my account, and that way, even if they had still invited in the account, I couldn't be authenticated against it, so they are now protected in that business to business model to be able to now provide for whether it's maybe other divisions in your company. Maybe you've grown through acquisition and they have their own tenant. You want to be able to have those users communicate with each other. These are all complex ways that we can use in this modern identity world to be able to provide this simple, complex, and secure way to manage identities. When we take a look at groups, the groups are going to fall into two major categories. They fall into the major category of a security group and a M365 group, and we'll be talking about that in just a minute. The other grouping that we have is the type of group that they are from a membership. You can always assign a user to a group. So you can manually assign a user inside of a group. You could then remove that user from the group. So it is a process that you have to administer. The other thing that we could now do is we can have dynamic group membership based around some characteristic. Now this only comes at certain either the P1 or P2 licensing capabilities that we talked about in a previous module. We talked about having a free Entra ID license. We have a P1, a P2, or the Entra Suite license that you have capability. So dynamic group membership is a capability that comes with a licensing requirement that has the capability to assign the licenses to the specific users that you might want to have this capability. And it would be my strong recommendation, and I'll do a whiteboard of this in a minute, of how to actually build group nesting to be actually the assignment of how users are going to be proliferated through your authorization model within your system that you're building. So groups have different capabilities based around license assignments that they're working with. Here's catching up with the book pieces. You can see that there's the P1 and the P2 licenses, going back to the recording where we showed you the capabilities. The other features that are going to come with some of the license requirements that you're dealing with is a thing called PIM, or Privileged Identity Management. This is a great capability. Don't really talk a lot about it in the class, but what you now can do, and I'm going to show you how to manage groups by dynamically have people in and out of a group, but you can also actually have privileged identity management capabilities that says, hey, this group has got these people in it. Maybe it's for a short-lived project. And what happens at the end of the project? Or maybe it's a long-running project and people are moving around in the organization. You can have systems that will automatically, on a scheduled basis, say, hey, listen, you need to reevaluate your membership in this group. And whether it be going to the individuals, hey, are you still a member of that project team? Do you still need to be a member of this group? So you could self-attest to still needing access to that group. Or it could go to maybe a group owner that is responsible for it and says, hey, Bob is a member of this group. Does he still need to be in it? And it could be then a user that, oh, I didn't know that Bob was still in there, and take them out. Or you could actually program it to say, hey, if I don't get an evaluation from either the self-attestation or the project manager saying that that user needs to be in it, it will then by default either disable the account or remove it from the group. So there's all these great management capabilities, again, available at the different licensing capabilities for the group memberships that you might have available to you. I want to take a look at the whiteboarding of how this might work, and then we're going to go take a look at how dynamic group membership actually plays out in this model. So before I jump into this, just to recap some of this, we covered this in a previous recording. We have our Azure environment, which is referred to as a multi-tenanted environment. We cover this in detail in the governance model. And what you're seeing across this top line up here is multiple tenants can exist in a geography. I'm not going to get into it in this course. It's covered again in the governance piece. But I'm going to focus on this one tenant that we have. There's a tenant name that comes along with it. Now, all tenants inside of Azure have an onmicrosoft.com name. So if I focus in on here, you'll see that they all have something on Microsoft.com. Even Microsoft inside of Azure is Microsoft.onmicrosoft.com. Now, that gets a little confusing. I mentioned that in a previous recording that I own my own domain name, Tickleman, tickleman.com, but I would confuse the heck out of my family if I said, oh, and by the way, when you sign into your email, you got to sign into tickleman.onmicrosoft.com. They would scratch their heads. And so one of the things that you'll see is Entra ID has the capability of registering custom domain names inside of it. You could have multiple. So I was able to take tickleman.onmicrosoft.com And because I was able to verify that I own that domain name, I now can have my users log in to that tenant using their domain name. Now, some of you are familiar with the on-premises world of Active Directory domain services. You probably saw a thing called a UPN, or a user principal name, where you could register domain names other than your tenant that you had on premises. This would be an equivalent, not the same, an equivalent type of feature available to you in the cloud environment. I mentioned that there is two parts of your tenant where you have resource management on the left-hand side of the screen and identity management on the right-hand side. And there's that tight one-to-one relationship of an identity provider to a tenant. And that's where often people will confuse your directory as your tenant. It's not. It is the tenant directory inside of a tenant. Now, coming back to the model that we were talking about, if I were to have a B2B model, I could have a user account inside of the Contoso tenant that could be invited into another tenant into its directory stutter. So it's going to be invited in. And while it's in potentially a group, it doesn't really authenticate there. So it can be put into a group. It's going to then give RBAC access to the resources and resource management. They're yours. You can control who can access and what they can do. But the authentication is going to be done based back on that original tenant. So I can now invite users in, or I could go into that B to C model where it's going to go off to something like the 4 that are owned by Microsoft. As I said, you could also go potentially to a wide variety. I think at last count there was over 31 third-party providers, things like Gmail or Facebook, that can provide that identity authentication in a business to consumer. Now, drilling back in, we talked about the different types of identities. And there are names that sound the same but are different, and there's things that sound the different but are the same. And I want to try and focus on a couple of these things. Inside of your tenant directory, we have user principals versus user objects that you're working with. So we have identities, which are a general broad term. You don't have an identity per se, but identities have characteristics. We have identities and applications. Now, everything down the right-hand side here, I'll mark as new. These are capabilities that have come when we moved to Entra as our identity provider versus that legacy capability. So there's a whole new set of identities that are available for you, and I'll get a bit more into this in a minute. On the left-hand side, I'll call this legacy, with some features becoming new in a legacy environment. And I'm going to focus specifically on the devices. In the past, we had the capability to have domain join devices like Windows 10, like Windows 11, and in previous versions, older versions of Windows, Windows 7, Windows 8, we could have them domain joined. That meant that they fall under the governance of the domain that they joined in the on-premises world. You had things called GPOs, or group policy objects, that allowed you to control every single attribute of the operating system. You could change what desktop image they used. You could change what folders were shared. A whole bunch of different characteristics that you could manage with these things called GPOs. Now, those devices, Windows domain joined only. What we get that's new in this world are things like iOS, Android. And these are that BYOD world. We get Mac and Linux capabilities. And so I have a wider variety. I even have, for myself, my Microsoft laptop is not domain joined to Microsoft. I registered. I wiped out the operating system that they put on it, and I then registered it. So it has a light control versus a full control under the difference between joining and registering. So these are new capabilities to an old service like devices that we used to have. So you're seeing some of those differences that we're working with. The groups that we have are pretty much the same as they've always been. Group is a way to manage objects, and it's better than managing the individuals themselves. And I've showed this in a previous model. that you want to have a hierarchical group structure, and I'll be whiteboarding this in a minute, where you, by putting a user into a group, they're automatically going to get joined into a variety of other groups throughout your enterprise. And so simply by adding a group user to a group, you can propagate that membership across the enterprise, which typically doesn't change, but the people performing the roles do. So I'm currently working in a role, I get put into a group, and that group is nested through a variety of others. I no longer do that role, I get taken out, and I lose all the inherited permissions that I get through all the group memberships that I had. This becomes the only scalable way to be able to manage this. You don't want to get around assigning individual users to objects, and I'll be doing an example of that in a few minutes as well. So we have this term of that UPN, the user principal name, as a way, that's that legacy feature of putting different domain structures onto a name. So if you had, say, multiple names to your identity provider, I showed Contoso and Fabricam, I could say this user is going to be registered to the Contoso domain, and I've got another user that might be registered to the Fabricam domain. So I've got multiple names in a single directory. They don't have to have the onmicrosoft.com name that's associated with it. They can have their own, and you can manage those attributes around the user. Now, just showing you something that's going to come up in the demonstration that I go to at the portal, I've created a small snippet of a larger model that I've been showing to customers for years. And I would go in, and you'll see this in a minute in another demonstration, that people have always given users access to something, and it becomes an absolute nightmare and a huge security breach. What you want to be using is this group model that we've been trying to teach people, and I have to get the pushback on, well, gosh, I wish I'd known this years ago, Bob. And I'm going, well, stop doing it the old way, because when is doing it the wrong way, you know, the wrong way, and you have to start doing it the right way. Well, it's going to take me all this time to get this new model to deploy it. It's absolutely the best way, especially if you're new to Azure. You're going to have to implement this at the start and then get these good habits from the beginning. So I've got a series of users. I'm going to come in at this middle level here. I've got a user who is going to become a member of West Sales. And we're going to show you, you can assign this to the group or you can dynamically assign it. I'm going to have another user here on the right-hand side, and that user is going to become a member of the East Sales Manager. By nesting groups together, and so I'm going to make this one called Dynamic. So based on some attribute of that user, they are location, East, and their role, MGR. Those attributes, location East, role manager, is going to put them in the East Sales Manager group. That is going to be dynamically assigned. And if that user no longer is a sales manager, maybe they move to a VP, I change that role, and they're now a VP role. They will be dynamically removed from that group and its nesting, and they may get new group memberships through a number of attributes based around the role that they now have. I've got a user on that left that is based on attributes that have them as West location and role is sales user. Now I'm going to nest these groups. All West Sales is a member of, has membership in West Sales Manager and West Sales User. And that's going to then go up into all sales. I've got my East users and my East managers in all East that are now a member of all sales. That might end up being all company. That might have all HR from other locations coming into all company. I've got all sales users that might have West Sales users and East Sales Usernet, and I've got West Sales managers in the all sales managers that is part of all managers. I've got all HR managers in that group. So that model is something you want to start thinking about of building scale, because the org doesn't change a whole bunch. These are going to be assigned, so they're not dynamic. They're going to be assigned that have to take some process, usually a change control process. So you've got this well mapped out, and if somebody says, I need access to something, you're going to say, can you please verify why you need access to it? Well, I took on a new role. Well, then how do we then maybe dynamic, or how do we assign that to that role? You have to go through a change control process as opposed to just, oh, I'll take your word for it and give you access to those resources. So this is the model that I'm going to demonstrate to you in a few minutes. Now, before I go there, and I want to show you what the potential issue is. What you're seeing on the screen, and I can do this in the demonstration, is a thing called access control list, and it has access control entries. So ACLs, or access control list, is a property assigned to an object. This could be a share, it could be a printer, it could be an entire drive, it could be a file inside of a folder. So this is how permissions are worked with. Now, in a previous recording, I talked about the Active Directory domain services and this thing called a token. You would get that token. On that token, at the time you're authenticated, is a membership of all the SIDs, of all the groups and user IDs that you have. They all get written to that token. So now what the problem is, at the time of logon, the token gets created with all these lists. You then come as a user, you have your token with your SIDs on it, and you might have multiple. You provide that to a thing called the LSA, the Local Security Authority, on that server, on that resource, whatever it is. The LSA then compares your token to the access control lists, and it looks for the access control entries that match the SID of your user account on your tokens. And here's the golden rule. Child objects inherit things from their parent. Now, this is going to come up in other recordings. Now, that's a general rule. In this case, permissions as child objects are inherited from their parent. So in here, below the SID test directory, if I have HR, and below HR I have data, so all of these are directories. Child objects by default inherit something from their parent. In this case, the access control list. And you'll see this with this light gray. It's telling you that the read and execute permission was inherited from its parent object. So SID test inherited something from its parent object, which is in this case the F drive. So it's important that you understand child objects inherit things, in this case permissions, from its parent. Now what I want to show you here, and this will be done in more detail in another recording, what you're seeing now is a resource that had been given permissions to it by a user account with that SID. I talked about what a SID is, S-1-5. This is referred to as the domain SID, and then there's a thing called a RID, or relative identifier, which identifies the user in that domain. But in this case, if you've seen this example before, I'm not going to go too deep into it now. I'll do this in the security portion of the course. What happened is I had a user, and it was S-1-5-21. Let's say whatever that number is, that's their user account. Somebody at some time associated that SID with that user with this permission. That user left, and they deleted that user account. Perfect. They thought that their security issues were over. I deleted the user account. They can't log in anymore. Here's the problem with Kerberos and why we had to possibly change, or why we had to change when we moved to the cloud. That token that I talked about gets given to you by the domain controller at logon, but there's a thing called token spoofing. I could create that token as an individual, hacker. I could create a token. I could start putting just random attributes in there, and there's ways to figure out what these numbers should look like, so I'm not going to get into that right now, but go in and do either a Bing or Google search or use Copilot and ask it about token spoofing. I could spoof that SID. It can't be authenticated because it no longer exists in the domain controller, but if I could spoof that SID as a bad actor, if I have that token, and if I show up at the LSA with that number on the token, guess what? It gives me access. It gives me access to that object. So you have to run a utility that deletes what are called stranded SIDs in your environment, because otherwise it's a security breach. You think you've solved your problem by getting rid of the account, but if that information is still on the objects, they still are potentially granted access based around that stale information. So what we have to be able to do is, if I give that user to a group, give that to the token. By removing the user from the group still has access to it. I don't have to manage it. All the other users have access to it. So I'm not managing at a user level. I'm just putting users in and out of groups, and I don't have to worry about the thousands or hundreds of thousands of objects that are in all the file shares and all the file locations and all the permissions that you're working with. So this is an important concept, not really talked about in the books, but this is why identity management inside of Azure is so much better than our legacy environments in the on-premises world. So let's go ahead and take a look at the portal itself. I'm going to show you some of this in action. And there's actually a lab for this that we'll close out with, that if you were doing the lab, it's going to step you through and perform the exact steps of the lab, which somewhat mirror what I'm going to do in the whiteboard. Let's go there now. So I'm actually in the Azure portal, and I want to demonstrate a lot of the things that we just talked about. So I've logged into portal.azure.com. I've got a user account that has permissions to do this, and I've come specifically to the Entra ID blade that we're working with. In here on the overview page, you'll see this link to a new portal that gives easier administration. I've already clicked on it, but this is where you're going to get into the Entra Administration Center, where if all that person does is manage identities, they don't have to have the complexity of the full portal. They can work with it as this graphical interface if you want to take a look at that, but you can get in there from an easy management perspective. I've come down to manage users, and I've got a series of users that I have inside of my tenant. You'll see that a number of these tenants are members in my directory services. These are users that I created by creating a new user, and you come through and create all these different attributes. This will be done in the lab that's associated with this. I'm not going to go into it now. You'll see the creation of all these different attributes across the different characteristics of a user account. We talked about inviting in a user. So I'm going to invite in another user, and I'm going to add in my personal email, rjbt@outlook.com. Now I can have it a display name. I can have Trainer Bob. I could send an email message. Hi there, welcome in. You can have terms of agreement. You can have different types of notifications, whatever you want. You can put an email out there. I'm just going to send that invitation. And I'll come back to this in a minute. I'll go to my email, pick up that, and I'll show it to you. But I'm inviting in a user to be a member inside of my directory. Now I'm going to focus on this user right here and change some attributes, but I'm going to go to the groups first. So I'm going to come back to the Entra main blade. I'm going to come into group memberships, and I can take a look at all the different groups. And you're starting to see that structure of groups that I talked about. I can create a new group. I can create the group as either a security group or an M365 or Microsoft 365 group. This difference being, is it a group that can be used to assign security characteristics, or is it a group that can be used as a distribution list inside of your Exchange system? Now, the security group could be both. It could have distribution capabilities in the mail system because it has an email address, and it has the ability to assign security. The M365 only has the ability to have a mail distribution capability assigned to it. You have a group description, a group naming structure. You'll see that I follow the Microsoft recommendations around that naming structure. I do encourage you to understand what that is. Do a Bing search on Microsoft Azure Naming Convention. You'll see where that recommendation follows on the pattern that I'm using. We're going to take a look at the role can be assigned to a group. And then how is the membership, is it going to be assigned? So you manually have to put things in and out of the group, or are you going to allow for that dynamic user or device membership in the group? Now remember, some of these only come with specific licenses to be able to provide the dynamic capabilities. And you can see its members. I'm going to come back to the group that I already have, and I want to take a look at one of them. You'll see those groups that I've talked about. And so I've got sales group, sales users west, sales group, sales users east. I've got sales group, sales users all. And you'll take a look that sales users all has members that were assigned to it from the sales users east and the sales users west. I'm going to go into the sales users west. I take a look at its members, and I've got Paul in here, and it was a member. I'd go take a look at Paul's information. Properties. If I come down into job, you can see he's a sales user and he's in the west. So the department and the job title put that into that group. Now if I come back into the sales users west, if I take a look at its dynamic group membership rules, you're seeing that I could add more expressions, but I've got one in here that says if it equals sales users for a job title and the department is west, that will then put them in. And if I just take that one attribute off because it doesn't meet both conditions, it will then remove them. So all this complex configuration, you could then get group memberships very easily being dynamically assigned throughout the entire enterprise. But I'm going to go back into my existing user that I had. There's my trainer Bob has now showed up. I'm going to come back to that one in just a minute. I'm going to get into the properties here. So what I'm going to now do is add the attributes to take this user and add him into the sales users west group. Now if you remember, the characteristics were going to edit the fields of job title. So it's sales user and the department was west. Save. And I should now be able to go back to the groups. All groups. So going into the sales users west, we should now see in its members should now have that user dynamically added to them. And we saw that through that hierarchical structure, as a member of sales users west, he's going to be a member of all west sales. He's going to be a member of all sales. And eventually, as you stack them all up as I diagrammed it out, he could be a member of all company that you're working with. So that whole group nesting capability is a great feature for you. This brings that module to an end. And what we've seen is the creation of user accounts at a variety of different levels directly inside of the tenant, inviting them in from either a business to business or a business to consumer model that you're working with, and then using the recommended model of groups and group nesting and dynamic memberships that allow for a proper deployment of permissions later on, which we'll cover in the RBAC module. But this is just managing and governing users and what groups that they belong to. And we saw that we had the capability of having both users and devices inside of the group memberships you're working with. Thanks for joining us for this session. To continue your learning, watch other videos in the course or explore more on Microsoft Learn at aka.ms/learn.